Hello, everyone. I am here to talk about an author who is rapidly becoming one of my favorite authors of all time. And that is, of course, the magisterial Naomi Novik. I read my first Naomi Novik book this year, just kind of accidentally. Like, I was between series and was looking for a book to read and came across Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik and was like, this looks kind of interesting. And so I read it, and I got a little bit obsessed, and I have now read every novel that Naomi Novik has ever published. And so today I'm going to walk you through everything she's written and give you some recommendations about where to start with Naomi Novik. So to start off with, the question is, what can you expect from a Novik novel? And the difficulty is, as opposed to an author like Joe Abercrombie, who I talked about last month, where you have, there's a specific style. There's a specific style of book that Abercrombie writes, and when you pick up one of his books, that's what you're getting. And Novik has a much broader, she's experimenting a lot more with what she's doing. So stylistically, her books are actually very different. I think there's 3 distinct styles that she's writing in, and I'll get into that later. So what you can expect from a Naomi Novik book is they're going to be very accessible. She has a very accessible writing style, very easy to get into these worlds. I don't want to say popular, because she's very thoughtful as a author, and that is, I think, one of her strengths. While she plays to a lot of popular tropes or popular story forms, she's doing it in really thoughtful and creative ways. So there's a lot of depth to her writing, but not in a swanky literary way that's hard to get into. And I think that's what I love about Novik so much, is I can pick up one of her books, I can be engaged from chapter 1, and then halfway through the book realize the amount of thought and care she's put into this story. And that's, I really highly admire an author who can do that. So let's talk about the 3 different styles of book that Naomi Novik has written. And actually, I should interject here a quick caveat. I'm talking about all of the novels that Naomi Novik has published. And I specify novels because there is a graphic novel that she has written called Will Supervillains Be on the Test? And I have not read this one, unfortunately. Graphic novels, I do almost all of my reading through audiobooks, and so graphic novels are just not something I'm able to get into at the moment. I'm confident that's an amazing book. I just am not going to be reviewing it in this video because I haven't read it. So all of Naomi Novik's novels, but there is one graphic novel out there. Hey, if one of you guys watching this has read the novel, or read the graphic novel, tell me in the comments. Let me know how good it is. I'm assuming it's phenomenal, because everything else Naomi Novik has done is phenomenal. But that's enough of that digression. So, the 3 styles of novel that Naomi Novik has written. First off, you have her Scholomance trilogy. And this is very popular urban fantasy style. Then you have her Temeraire series. This is 9 books. And this is her black powder fantasy, kind of. I'll caveat that when I talk about the series. And then you have her standalone fantasy books. And all 3 of those kind of have their own distinct style. So, starting off then, if we're going to review each of these in turn, we'll start off with the Scholomance trilogy. So, the Scholomance, if you are a fan of romantasy or kind of popular fantasy novels, specifically ones that are really trope heavy, this is where I would recommend starting with Naomi Novik. Now, for those of you who are not a fan of trope heavy writing, hang in there, because I think this series is really spectacular for what it does. It follows a very similar plot framework and follows similar tropes to books like, say, Fourth Wing. However, I think the way Naomi Novik does the tropes in this book really underscores how talented she is as a writer and how thoughtful she is as a writer. Because whereas most romantasy books are just going to pull off the lead female is like the girl who's not like other girls sort of a trope, and that is it. That is all the character development you get. For Galadriel, the heroine of the Scholomance, she is not like other girls, but that's just very surface level, and there's so much more to her character. And as the series progresses, you really get to know Galadriel and fall in love with her as a very distinct character. Even though, on the surface, she's a girl not like any other girl, who's very similar to, again, on the surface, to other romantasy heroines. Similarly, you have the enemies to lover romance trope. That's a heavy trope pulled into this book. But Naomi Novik uses that more as just like a seasoning to build the broader story off of, instead of relying so heavily on this trope to drive the plot forward. I think people who are already a fan of those tropes are just going to be obsessed with this book because of how skillfully Naomi Novik pulls them off. And for those of us, like me, who don't typically like trope-heavy books, this series, The Scholomance, was so refreshing because you're like, yes, this is the way it's supposed to be. This is how a trope should be pulled off. And it really helps me put into perspective tropes in literature, because after reading Fourth Wing as a concrete example, I was like very much like, why are tropes even a thing anymore? And so seeing Naomi Novik pulling them off so skillfully was very refreshing. Another thing I really loved about The Scholomance is it is more than just a... Naomi Novik doesn't make it easy for herself in the story that she's trying to tell. She's not just giving the same tired old empire is bad and we need to overthrow it, but really wrestling with the difficulty of a system that has been set up to be equal to all people, but hasn't addressed the fundamental inequalities that pre-exist that system. And so how this system that was set up well with good intentions to be helpful to the magical community is just causing further problems because no one's willing to address the root causes of the issues in the magical community. Hopefully that is vague enough to not be a spoiler for anything in the series. But I loved Naomi Novik's storytelling and the thought that she put into the world building. Truly amazing. Even coming from someone who doesn't like urban fantasy very much and abhors a lot of tropey writing, Naomi Novik sold me on this series. Sold me. So, if you really like urban fantasy or romantasy or popular fantasy in general, start with The Scholomance. If you don't like those sorts of books, this is still worth your time, but maybe start somewhere else. So, that moves on to my favorite Naomi Novik series, which is the Temeraire series. These are 9 books, and they're generally advertised as black powder fantasy. However, they pull very heavily from history. It is literally the Napoleonic Wars with dragons. And because there's no magic system anywhere in the series, and also the dragons themselves are handled in a very naturalistic way. Because of that, I almost feel like this series is more of alternate history than black powder fantasy, because a lot of the classical fantasy elements of magic are absent. And Naomi Novik is pulling from very real-world historical settings. Her first book was really meticulously historically accurate. But when she starts changing things, and in the first books, it's just a couple very minor things that someone who's not super familiar with the history probably wouldn't even notice. But then how she makes those minor changes have dramatic ripple effects into the rest of history, and so that the history diverges so dramatically from our own, was so entertaining. I am a giant history nerd, so I loved seeing the historical resonances, but then I was obsessed with the changes she was making, and frankly, just absolutely gobsmacked at how far she was willing to pull things. The ripples that she was willing, like the effects she was willing to go to, was spectacular, and I loved it. But I think where this book really shines through is, or this book series, where this book series really shines through, is through the central relationship of the two protagonists, Lawrence, Captain Lawrence, and then his dragon, Temeraire, who is, of course, who the series is named after. And in that sense, this series feels a lot like older literature, like Jane Austen almost, or even it really heavily reminded me of the Master and Commander series by Patrick O'Brian. So, if you are a fan of older literature, like older action-adventure literature, or Jane Austen, if you're a fan of history, this is definitely where you need to start with Naomi Novik. If you are not as much into classical literature and like slower storytelling, because these books are a little bit slower than like The Scholomance is super fast, and these books slow down a little bit more, like a Jane Austen novel would. You're still going to really find enjoyment out of these books, even if you are into faster paced novels. But maybe start somewhere else. But again, for the history fans, for the fans of classic adventure literature, this is absolutely where I would recommend starting with Naomi Novik. And for me personally, this is my favorite series by Naomi Novik. So then, moving on to the 3 standalone novels by Naomi Novik. These are Spinning Silver, Uprooted, and The Summer War. All 3 of these feel very much like retellings of classic folk stories, like stories from like the Brothers Grimm. So they have a very distinct style, kind of similar to like maybe some of T. Kingfisher's works, or like Stardust by Neil Gaiman. It's kind of got those vibes to it. And frankly, all of these books are amazing. I love them. Spinning Silver is probably my favorite Naomi Novik book of all times. And for anybody kind of who's interested in Naomi Novik who doesn't have strong fantasy preferences, this is where I would recommend starting, is Spinning Silver. It is amazing. It is kind of takes like a medieval Eastern European setting with the heroine being the daughter of a Jewish moneylender, and then takes that setting and then uses it to reimagine in a really clever way the folktale of Rumpelstiltskin. So it was phenomenal. It really strongly resonated with me, with like similar feelings to Fiddler on the Roof, and I'm obsessed with Fiddler on the Roof, so this book really scratched an itch for me that I haven't had scratched in a long time, and I loved it. I am obsessed with Spinning Silver. My one caveat is, because Novik tells this story in first-person POV with multiple POVs, the feedback I've often heard from people who physically read this book is that it can sometimes be confusing who is talking when. Since I did it as audiobook and the narrator did a phenomenal job distinguishing between the characters, I never had any confusion, but maybe that's something to keep in mind before reading this book, is this might be one worth doing on audio if that's an option for you. And if you have to read it in physical, just be prepared for, there might be some clunky moments where it's difficult to tell who is talking because it's first-person narrative with multiple POVs. But otherwise, I highly, highly recommend Spinning Silver for everyone. Then moving on to Uprooted. This one was also just a delightful novel. It wasn't inspired by like a specific folktale, but feels very, very much drawn from the well of like the Grimm brothers folktales. So yeah, it's just kind of like, feel a little bit like Tangled maybe, a little bit of the classic, the heroine being taken by the dragon, except in this case, the dragon is just a crotchety old wizard. And it's delightful. It's delightful. Not my favorite Naomi Novik book ever, but definitely worth a read, especially once you've read some of her other books. And then that brings us to The Summer War. This is a novella, her most recent book. And frankly, this one is just purely delightful. It has a little bit of like the folk tale vibes of the previous 2 standalone novels that I talked about. But also this one pulls very strongly on like the chivalric romance, like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, or like Spenser's The Fairy Queen, which like that's not a genre I am like, you don't see that very often at all. Like maybe you could argue that The Last Unicorn follows that genre, but like otherwise there's not many other books I can think of that pull from that chivalric romance. And I loved it. It was really refreshing and delightful. Yeah, the characters were cool. The twists and turns that she pulls off were great. I loved it. I loved it. And I mean, as you probably can tell by now, there's not a single Naomi Novik book I have read that I didn't love. So maybe that makes me biased. But there we are. There's my reviews of all the works of Naomi Novik, with the exception of the one graphic novel that I haven't read. Yeah, let me know. Have you read Naomi Novik? What did you think of her? Do you disagree with any of my takes? I would love to fight you in the comments about it, because obviously I'm right and you're wrong. Just joking, but not really. But yeah, that's that for now. So happy reading. Please go pick up a Naomi Novik novel. Let's send more people to her fandom. I'm sure she already has a dedicated fandom, but let's build it, guys. Come on, let's build it, because she deserves it. So yeah, that's that for now, and happy reading. Till next time.